The day Frank Emerson found the widow stranded on the icy riverbank was the day winter tried to kill them both, and the day everything in his life changed forever. He had been leading his pack mule along the frozen trail outside Dillon, Montana, when he spotted her standing beside an overturned wagon, her dark cloak whipping in the bitter wind that howled down from the mountains. The date was February 14, 1883, though Frank did not think much of Valentine's Day when his breath frosted in the air and his fingers ached inside his leather gloves. The Beaverhead River stretched before them, partially frozen, chunks of ice floating like jagged teeth in the gray water. Frank urged his horse closer, the animal's hooves crunching through the snow. The woman turned at his approach, and even from a distance, he could see the worry etched into her features. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with auburn hair pulled back beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress, though well made, showed signs of hard travel, and her green eyes held a determination that surprised him. "Madam," Frank called out, touching the brim of his hat. "You in need of help?" "My wagon wheel broke a mile back," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. "I managed to get what I could carry to this point, but I need to cross the river. My sister is sick in Virginia City. The telegraph said she might not last the week." Frank dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. He was 28 years old, tall and lean from years of working cattle and living off the land. His dark hair needed cutting, and his jaw bore 3 days of stubble, but his blue eyes were kind when he looked at her. "That's a dangerous crossing this time of year. The ice is not solid enough to walk on, but there is enough of it to make a boat risky." "I know," she said, "but I have to try. She is all the family I have left. You are alone out here." "I am a widow," she said simply. "My husband died of fever last autumn. My name is Willa Coleman." "Frank Emerson," he replied. "I run cattle over near the Ruby Valley when I am not hauling supplies." He looked at the river, calculating. "There is an old barge about half a mile upstream. Fellow who used to run a ferry operation left it when he moved to California. It might still be serviceable." Hope flickered in her eyes. "Would you help me reach it?" Frank studied her for a long moment. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping as the pale sun sank lower in the sky. Every sensible bone in his body told him to ride on, to tell her to wait for better weather. But something in her eyes, that mixture of fear and fierce resolve, made him nod. "We will need to move fast. This weather is only going to get worse." They gathered what supplies Willa had salvaged from her wagon: a small trunk of clothing, a leather bag that jingled with coins, and a carpet bag filled with what looked like medicines and dried food. Frank loaded everything onto his mule while Willa explained that she had sold most of her belongings to fund this journey. "My sister married a mining engineer," Willa said as they walked upstream, Frank leading his horse and mule while she struggled through the snow beside him. "She moved to Virginia City 2 years ago. When my husband was alive, we planned to visit, but there was never time. The ranch demanded everything." "What kind of ranch?" Frank asked, partly to keep her talking, partly because he was genuinely curious. "Sheep," Willa said, and she almost smiled. "I know cattle ranchers do not think much of sheep, but it was honest work. After Thomas died, I could not manage it alone. I sold to a family from Scotland." Frank did not reply immediately. He had never understood the hatred some ranchers held for sheep farmers. Work was work, and the land was big enough for everyone if people would just be reasonable about it. "Nothing wrong with sheep," he said finally. "Wool is as valuable as beef." The barge sat where Frank remembered it, pulled up on the bank and half buried in snow. It was a flat-bottomed vessel, perhaps 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, built from thick planks that had weathered to gray. Frank brushed away the snow, checking the wood for rot. To his relief, it seemed mostly sound, though the ropes were frayed and the poles used for pushing were nowhere to be seen. "It will work," he said, "but we will need to fashion some poles, and we will have to be very careful. That ice can crush us if we are not smart about it." Willa did not hesitate. She began gathering fallen branches from the cottonwood trees that lined the bank, while Frank used his axe to cut 2 long, sturdy poles from a dead pine. The physical work warmed them both, though their breath still misted in the frigid air. As they worked, Frank found himself stealing glances at Willa. She moved with efficiency, never complaining about the cold or the difficulty of the task. Her hands, he noticed, were rough with calluses, the hands of a woman who knew hard work. When she caught him looking, she did not blush or look away but met his gaze with a straightforwardness that he found refreshing. "How long have you been in Montana?" she asked, dragging a branch over to the barge. "Going on 6 years now," Frank replied. "Came up from Wyoming after the big die-off of '77, lost everything in that winter. Figured Montana could not be much worse." "And was it?" Frank grinned. "Some winters, yes, but it is good country, honest country. A man can make something of himself if he works hard enough." They used ropes from Frank's pack to lash the poles securely to the sides of the barge, then began the laborious process of pushing the vessel down to the water. The river here ran about 200 yards wide, with chunks of ice floating in the current. The water looked black and merciless. "We should wait until morning," Frank said, though he knew even as he spoke that they could not. The sky to the northwest was darkening with the promise of a storm. "If we wait, the storm will trap us," Willa said. "I can see it in the clouds, the same as you. We cross now, or we do not cross at all." She was right, and Frank knew it. He helped her load her belongings onto the barge, then brought his horse and mule aboard. The animals were nervous, their eyes rolling white, but they trusted him enough to step onto the unstable platform. Frank pushed off from the bank, using one of the poles to propel them into the current. The barge rocked alarmingly, and Willa grabbed the side to steady herself. Ice-cold water splashed over the edge, soaking their feet. "Stay low and centered," Frank instructed. "If we hit ice, we need our weight balanced." The current caught them immediately, pulling them downstream faster than Frank had anticipated. He leaned hard on the pole, his muscles straining as he fought to angle them across the river rather than simply being swept away. Willa, without being asked, grabbed the second pole and began pushing from the other side. "You have done this before?" Frank asked, surprised. "Rivers do not care if you are a woman," Willa replied through gritted teeth. "You learn what you need to survive." A large chunk of ice, bigger than the barge itself, floated toward them. Frank saw it coming and shouted a warning. Willa saw it too, and together they pushed hard, angling the barge away from the collision. The ice scraped along the side with a grinding sound that set Frank's teeth on edge, but they cleared it. The wind was brutal now, cutting through their clothes like knives. Frank could not feel his hands anymore, though he kept them locked on the pole. Beside him, Willa was breathing hard, her face red from exertion and cold, but she never stopped working. Another piece of ice struck them, this one smaller but faster. The impact sent a shudder through the barge, and Frank heard wood crack. Water began seeping up through the planks near the center. "We are taking on water," he called out. "How far to the other side?" Willa asked, her voice remarkably calm. Frank risked a glance. They were perhaps halfway across, but the current had carried them a good distance downstream. "Another 100 yards, but we will need to bail." Willa immediately dropped her pole and grabbed a tin cup from her carpetbag. She began scooping water and throwing it overboard with frantic efficiency. Frank kept them moving forward, though his arms screamed with fatigue. The horse whinnied in fear as more water pooled around its hooves. The mule, more pragmatic, simply stood still and endured. Frank talked to them in a low, steady voice, the same tone he used when breaking wild horses. An exceptionally large piece of ice loomed ahead, and Frank realized with a sinking feeling that they could not avoid it. "Brace yourself," he shouted. The impact, when it came, was brutal. The barge jerked to one side and Willa lost her footing. She would have gone over the side if Frank had not dropped his pole and lunged for her, catching her arm and pulling her back. They fell together onto the wet planks, the barge spinning in the current. For a moment, their faces were inches apart. Frank could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel her breath on his face. Then the barge hit another piece of ice, and the moment shattered. They scrambled up, both grabbing for the poles. Frank could see the far bank now, tantalizingly close. The water was shallower here and the current less fierce. He drove the pole down with all his remaining strength, feeling it hit bottom, pushing them forward. Willa was beside him, doing the same. Her bonnet had come loose, and her auburn hair streamed behind her in the wind. Her face was set with determination, her jaw clenched. Frank thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. With a grinding crunch, the barge struck the far bank. Frank jumped off immediately, landing in knee-deep water that was so cold it stole his breath. He did not care. He grabbed the rope at the front of the barge and hauled, dragging it further onto the shore. Willa helped push from behind, and together they beached the vessel. The horse and mule scrambled off gratefully. Frank's legs were shaking, whether from cold or exhaustion he could not tell. Willa collapsed onto the snowy bank, her chest heaving. "We made it," she gasped. "We actually made it." Frank looked back at the river, at the ice chunks floating past, at the storm clouds now rolling in fast from the northwest. They had perhaps an hour before the blizzard hit. "We need shelter," he said. "There is a line shack about 3 miles east. Can you ride?" Willa pulled herself to her feet, swaying slightly. "I can do whatever I need to do." Frank helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. He tied the mule's lead rope to the saddle horn and urged the horse forward. Willa leaned back against him, and he could feel her shivering. "Stay awake," he told her. "Talk to me. Tell me about your sister." "Her name is Sarah," Willa said, her voice shaky. "She is 3 years younger than me. We were close growing up, but after she married, we saw each other less. I should have visited. I should have made time." "You are making time now," Frank said. The line shack appeared through the swirling snow just as the storm hit in earnest. It was a rough structure, meant to house ranch hands during roundup, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Frank half-carried Willa inside, then went back for the animals. He crowded them into a lean-to attached to the side of the shack, giving them what shelter he could. Inside, Willa was trying to start a fire in the small stove with shaking hands. Frank took over, his own hands barely more functional. The kindling caught, and soon they had a small fire going. The warmth was a blessing beyond words. "We need to get out of these wet clothes," Frank said, then immediately felt his face heat. "I mean, you should wrap up in blankets. I will turn my back." Willa actually laughed, a small sound but genuine. "We just crossed a frozen river together, Mr. Emerson. I think we are past the point of excessive modesty." Still, she waited until he had turned before stripping off her wet dress and wrapping herself in the blankets he provided from his pack. Frank changed his own wet clothes quickly, pulling on spare trousers and a dry shirt. When he turned back, Willa was huddled near the stove, the blankets pulled tight around her. Her hair was drying in soft waves around her face. "There is coffee in my pack," he said, "and some jerky. Not much of a meal, but it will help." They ate in companionable silence, the storm howling outside. The shack was drafty, but the stove put out good heat, and slowly the bone-deep cold began to recede. "Thank you," Willa said finally, "for helping me. Another man might have ridden past." Frank poured more coffee into her tin cup. "I could not leave you there." "Why not? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Frank considered the question. Why had he helped? He could have told her where the barge was and ridden on. He could have given her supplies and wished her luck. But from the moment he had seen her standing by that broken wagon, so determined and so alone, he had known he would help. "I lost my mother when I was 12, he said slowly. "She got sick, and we were snowed in on our homestead in Kansas. Could not get her to a doctor. I have always wondered if someone could have helped, if someone had just been there when we needed them." He looked at Willa. "I guess I could not stand the thought of you losing your sister when maybe I could make a difference." Willa's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I am sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago. That does not make it hurt less." They talked long into the night, the storm raging outside. Willa told him about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about how she and Sarah used to play in the creek behind their house. She talked about meeting Thomas at a church social, about how he had promised her adventure and a new life out west. "Was it a good marriage?" Frank asked. Willa was quiet for a moment. "It was a marriage. Thomas was not a bad man, but he was not particularly a good one either. He worked hard, I will give him that, but he was not warm. We shared a life, but I am not sure we shared much else." Frank told her about his years in Wyoming, about the terrible winter that had killed 90% of the cattle. He talked about coming to Montana with nothing but his horse and his gear, about slowly building himself back up to where he now ran a small but profitable operation. "You want a family someday?" Willa asked. The question caught Frank off guard. "I suppose so. Never really thought about it much. I have been too busy trying to make a living." "That is the trap, is it not?" Willa said softly. "We are so busy surviving that we forget to live." The wind rattled the windows, and snow found its way through cracks in the walls. But inside the small circle of firelight, Frank felt warmer than he had in years. He watched Willa's face in the flickering glow, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she gestured when she talked about something that excited her. When she finally fell asleep, curled up in her blankets near the stove, Frank sat watch. He should have been exhausted, but his mind was too active. He kept replaying the river crossing, the way Willa had never panicked, had simply done what needed to be done. Her courage in the face of that ice and cold had been remarkable. While he had been focused on the physical challenge, on keeping the barge afloat and moving forward, she had made him forget about the fear, about the very real possibility that they might die. Her presence had warmed something in him that the cold could never touch. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. When Willa woke, weak sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the walls. She sat up, her hair tousled from sleep, and looked at Frank with a smile that made his heart skip. "Good morning," she said. "Morning. How do you feel?" "Alive," she said simply, "which is more than I might have been without you." They shared a breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then prepared to continue the journey. The snow had drifted high in places, but Frank knew the trails. Virginia City was about 50 miles northeast, a hard ride in good weather and a brutal one now. "We should reach the Ridgeway Ranch by tonight," Frank said as they saddled the horse. "They will put us up. From there, it is another day and a half to Virginia City." Willa nodded, pulling her now dry cloak tight around her shoulders. "I hope we are not too late." They rode through a landscape transformed by the storm. Snow covered everything in a white blanket that sparkled in the sunlight. The air was crisp and clean, so cold it hurt to breathe, but the sky was a brilliant blue that promised fair weather, at least for a while. Willa rode in front of Frank again, and they fell into an easy rhythm. She pointed out a herd of elk moving through the distant trees, and he showed her where a mountain lion had left tracks crossing the trail. They talked about everything and nothing, and Frank found himself laughing more than he had in months. "You have a good laugh," Willa said, turning slightly to look at him. "You should do it more often." "Have not had much to laugh about lately." "Why not?" Frank shrugged. "Ranching is serious business. Winter feeding, calving, trying to get a fair price at market. It does not leave much room for fun." "That sounds lonely." "I suppose it is, sometimes." The Ridgway Ranch appeared in the late afternoon, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a valley. Tom Ridgway was an old friend, a gruff man in his 50s who had been running cattle in Montana since before the territory became a state. His wife, Martha, was a plump, cheerful woman who took one look at Willa and Frank and immediately began fussing over them. "You look half frozen," Martha declared, ushering Willa inside. "Come on, we will get you warm and fed." That evening, sitting around the Ridgway's dining table with a hot meal in front of him, Frank felt a contentment he had not known in years. Willa was talking with Martha about cooking and preserving food, her face animated and bright. Tom was telling stories about the early days of Montana, when Dillon was barely more than a camp and outlaws roamed freely. "Those were wild times," Tom said, refilling Frank's coffee cup. "But I would not go back. I like having law and order, even if it is imperfect." After dinner, Frank stepped outside to check on the animals. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He heard the door open behind him and turned to see Willa approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Could not sleep?" he asked. "Too much on my mind," she admitted, coming to stand beside him. "I keep thinking about Sarah, wondering if she is all right." "We will get you there," Frank promised. Willa looked up at him, her face pale in the starlight. "Why are you doing this? You have already helped me more than anyone could expect. You could have left me at the line shack and gone back to your ranch." Frank met her eyes. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," she said softly. "I do not want you to leave. Then I will stay. I will see you to Virginia City, and I will make sure you get to your sister safely." And then, Frank did not have an answer for that. He did not know what would happen after they reached Virginia City. Would Willa stay with her sister? Would she return to wherever she had been planning to go? Would he ride back to his ranch and resume his solitary life? The thought of that last option, of going back to his empty cabin and his quiet days, suddenly felt unbearable. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but let us get through tomorrow first." Willa reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and warm in his. "Thank you, Frank, for everything." She went back inside, but Frank stood in the cold for a long time, his hand still warm from her touch. They left the Ridgway Ranch at first light, laden with supplies that Martha had insisted they take. The journey to Virginia City took them through some of the most beautiful country Frank had ever seen. High mountain valleys where pine forests gave way to open meadows, and frozen creeks that would run wild with snowmelt come spring. Willa rode her own horse now, a gentle mare that Tom had insisted she borrow. She sat the saddle well, moving with the horse's motion in a way that spoke of years of riding. "Thomas and I used to ride out to check the flock together," she said when Frank complimented her. "Before he got sick, anyway. Toward the end, he could barely get out of bed." "What did he die of?" "The doctor called it consumption, but I think it was just a general wasting away. He coughed blood for months. By the end, he was ready to go. I was ready for him to go too, God forgive me." There is no sin in wanting suffering to end. Is there not? The preacher at his funeral seemed to think I should have been more devastated, but the truth is I was mostly relieved. What does that make me? Human, Frank said. They camped that night in a grove of aspen trees, sheltered from the wind. Frank built a fire while Willa made a simple dinner from the supplies Martha had packed. They ate watching the flames, the horses dozing nearby. "Tell me about your ranch," Willa said. Frank described his spread in the Ruby Valley, the small but sturdy cabin he had built himself, the good grazing land and the creek that ran year-round. He talked about his plans to expand, maybe hire some help, build a proper barn. "It sounds lovely," Willa said wistfully. "It is a lot of work." The best things usually are. Later, as they settled into their bedrolls, Frank found himself acutely aware of Willa's presence just a few feet away. He could hear her breathing, could see the firelight playing across her face. She turned her head and caught him looking. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Frank hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I am thinking that I am going to miss you when this is over." Willa's expression softened. "Who says it has to be over? Your sister needs you. My sister has a husband. Once I know she is all right, once I can help her through the worst of whatever illness she is facing, what then? I have no home to return to, no family waiting for me anywhere." "What are you saying?" Willa sat up, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. "I am saying that maybe crossing that frozen river was not just about getting to Virginia City. Maybe it was about finding something I did not even know I was looking for." Frank's heart was pounding. "Willa." She moved closer, closing the distance between them. "I know we have only known each other for a few days, Frank. I know this is fast and probably foolish. But out there on that river, when we were fighting the ice and the current together, I felt more alive than I have in years. I felt like I had found someone who sees me, really sees me, not just as a widow or a sheep farmer's wife, but as Willa." Frank reached out, cupping her face in his hand. "I see you." When they kissed, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Willa's lips were soft and warm, and she tasted of coffee and hope. Frank pulled her closer, feeling her arms wrap around his neck, and for a moment, the cold and the darkness and all the uncertainty of the future faded away. They broke apart, breathing hard. Willa laughed softly, her forehead resting against his. "Well," she said, "that was worth freezing in a river for." Frank grinned. "We should probably freeze in rivers more often then." They settled back into their bedrolls, but Frank could not sleep. His mind raced with possibilities and plans. Could he truly be falling in love with this woman after only a few days? It seemed impossible, the stuff of dime novels rather than real life. But his heart did not care about logic. His heart only knew that Willa made him feel complete in a way he had never experienced before. They reached Virginia City in the late afternoon of the following day. The town was busy, miners and merchants crowding the streets despite the cold. Willa had the address of her sister's house, and they found it on the northern edge of town, a neat little home with smoke rising from the chimney. Willa dismounted with shaking hands. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Do you want me to come with you, please?" The door was answered by a tall man with a worried face and a thick beard. His eyes widened when he saw Willa. "Dear God, Willa, how did you get here? Is she alive, John?" "Is Sarah alive?" John's face crumpled. Come in, come in. She is alive, but she is very weak. The doctor says it is pneumonia. We are doing everything we can." Willa rushed inside, and Frank followed more slowly. The house was warm and clean, with the smell of cooking and sickness mingling in the air. A woman lay in a bed near the fireplace, pale and thin, her breathing labored. She opened her eyes as Willa approached, and a weak smile crossed her face. "Willa," Sarah whispered. "You came." "Of course I came," Willa said, kneeling beside the bed and taking her sister's hand. "Did you think a little winter weather would stop me?" Frank stepped back, giving the sisters privacy. John led him to the kitchen, where they sat at a rough table. "Thank you for bringing her," John said. "I did not think she would be able to make it through the mountains in this weather. Your wife's sister is a very determined woman." John smiled faintly. "Sarah always said Willa was the strong one. I guess she was right." He paused, studying Frank. "Are you and Willa?" "I do not know what we are," Frank said honestly, "but I care about her. Good. She deserves someone who cares." Over the following days, Frank stayed in Virginia City, taking a room at a boarding house but spending most of his time at Sarah and John's home. He helped John with chores, chopped wood, and fixed things that needed fixing. Mostly, though, he watched Willa. She was extraordinary. She sat with Sarah for hours, talking to her, reading to her, coaxing her to eat and drink. She mixed medicines according to the doctor's instructions and kept the sick room clean and warm. Gradually, Sarah began to improve. The fever broke, her breathing eased, and color returned to her cheeks. One evening, about a week after their arrival, Willa stepped outside for some fresh air. Frank followed her, finding her standing in the small yard looking up at the stars. "She is going to be all right," Willa said, her voice thick with emotion. "The doctor said so today. She is past the worst of it." "That is wonderful news." Willa turned to face him. "I could not have gotten here without you, Frank. If you had not helped me cross that river, if you had not brought me all this way, I would have been too late. You would have found a way. You are the most resourceful person I have ever met." Willa laughed. "Resourceful? Is that what you call stubborn?" "I call it courageous." Frank took her hands in his. "Willa, I need to ask you something." "What?" Frank took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. "When I met you on that riverbank, I was living a half-life. I was surviving, but I was not truly living. You changed that. These past days with you have been the happiest I can remember. I know it is fast. I know we have not known each other long, but I also know that what I feel for you is real." Willa's eyes were wide, her lips parted in surprise. Frank pushed on. "I am asking you to come back to Ruby Valley with me. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as my wife. I am asking you to build a life with me, to take the courage you showed on that frozen river and use it to face whatever comes next together." For a long moment Willa did not speak. Then, slowly, she smiled. "I thought you would never ask." Frank felt his heart soar. "Is that a yes?" "It is a yes," Willa said, and then she was in his arms, kissing him with a passion that made the cold night feel tropical. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Virginia City. Sarah, now mostly recovered, stood up as Willa's witness, tears streaming down her face. John stood up for Frank, and the circuit preacher performed the service in Sarah and John's parlor. Willa wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Frank wore his best suit, the one he had brought from Wyoming and rarely had occasion to use. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed his bride and felt like the luckiest man in Montana. They stayed another week in Virginia City, giving Sarah time to fully recover and making plans for the future. Willa wrote letters to friends back in Ohio, telling them of her marriage. Frank sent word to Tom Ridgway, asking him to check on the ranch in his absence. Finally, on a bright March morning, they said their goodbyes. Sarah hugged Willa tightly, making her promise to visit come summer. "I am so happy for you," Sarah whispered. "You deserve this happiness." "So do you," Willa replied. "Take care of yourself." The journey back to Ruby Valley was slower than the trip to Virginia City had been. There was no urgency now, no sick sister waiting, no frozen river to cross. Frank and Willa took their time, camping under the stars and talking long into the night. They stopped at the Ridgway Ranch, where Martha threw an impromptu celebration. Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving, and they toasted the newlyweds late into the evening. "You did good, Frank," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. "She is a fine woman." "I know," Frank replied, watching Willa laugh at something Martha had said. "Believe me, I know." When they finally reached Frank's ranch in the Ruby Valley, it was early April and the first signs of spring were appearing. The snow was melting, revealing green grass beneath, and the creek ran high with runoff. Frank helped Willa down from her horse, then swept her up in his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Emerson." Willa looked around at the cabin, the barn, the corrals, and the wide valley stretching out in all directions. "It is beautiful, Frank, truly beautiful." He carried her across the threshold, and they stood together in the small cabin that would now be their home. It was rustic, just one main room with a sleeping loft, a fireplace, and a simple kitchen area. But it was clean and well built, and Willa immediately began envisioning how to make it more comfortable. "We will need curtains," she said, "and a proper table. And I would like to plant a garden come spring." "Whatever you want," Frank said. "This is your home now as much as it is mine." They spent the next weeks settling into married life. Frank taught Willa the rhythms of the ranch, how to read the weather and the cattle, where the best fishing spots were on the creek. Willa brought warmth and life to the cabin, sewing curtains, cooking meals that were far better than the simple fare Frank had been living on, and filling the space with laughter. At night, they lay together in the loft, talking and making love and planning their future. Frank had never been so happy. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Willa took Frank's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have been meaning to tell you something," she said, a smile playing at her lips. Frank's eyes widened. "Are you?" "I am," Willa confirmed. "The baby should come in December if I am calculating correctly." Frank let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms. "A baby! We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Willa asked, though she was laughing at his reaction. "Happy does not even begin to cover it." Frank kissed her thoroughly, then pulled back to look at her. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need anything? Should you be sitting? Maybe you should be lying down." Willa laughed. "Frank, I am fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not made of glass." But Frank fussed over her anyway, insisting she rest more, hiring a local boy to help with the heavier ranch chores so Willa would not overexert herself. Willa tolerated his concern with amused patience, gently reminding him that she had run a sheep ranch by herself and was perfectly capable of doing normal work. As summer progressed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Frank worked the ranch, expanding his herd and building a new barn with the help of neighbors. Willa tended her garden, which flourished under her care, and began making preparations for the baby. Sarah and John visited in July, making the long trip from Virginia City. Sarah was glowing with health now, all signs of her illness gone. The sisters spent hours talking and catching up while Frank and John worked on the new barn. "You have a good life here," Sarah told Willa as they sat shelling peas in the garden. "I can see how happy you are." "I am," Willa agreed. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Sometimes I think about that day on the riverbank when I was so desperate and scared. If Frank had not come along, if he had not been willing to help a stranger, none of this would have happened." "God works in mysterious ways," Sarah said. "Maybe," Willa replied. "Or maybe sometimes good people just do good things, and that is enough." In late November, as the first serious snows began to fall, Frank rode to Dillon to fetch the midwife. Mrs. Patterson was an experienced woman who had delivered half the babies in the valley. She arrived at the ranch and took one look at Willa, who was pacing the cabin with her hand pressed to her lower back. "It will be soon," Mrs. Patterson announced. "Probably tonight or early tomorrow." Frank felt his stomach drop. "Tonight? But I thought we had more time." "Babies come when they are ready, not when we are," Mrs. Patterson said tartly. Now, you go boil some water and stay out of the way." The labor was long and difficult. Frank paced outside in the snow despite the cold, unable to sit still. He could hear Willa crying out, and each sound felt like a knife to his heart. He had faced stampedes and blizzards and a frozen river, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of waiting while his wife fought to bring their child into the world. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard a new sound, a baby's cry, thin and reedy but strong. Frank rushed to the door, but Mrs. Patterson held up a hand. "Give us a moment." It was the longest moment of Frank's life. Then the door opened, and Mrs. Patterson beckoned him in. Willa was in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," Willa said softly. Frank approached on shaking legs. He looked down at the baby, at the small red face and the wisps of dark hair, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "A son," he whispered. "We should name him Thomas," Willa said. "After my first husband, it feels right." Frank hesitated. He had not expected that, had assumed they would choose a new name, something that was just theirs. But looking at Willa's face, he understood. This was not about honoring a great love or clinging to the past. It was about acknowledging that her journey had started before she met him, and that was all right. "Thomas Frank Emerson," Frank said, "if that is all right with you." Willa's smile was radiant. "Perfect." The winter that followed was hard, with heavy snows and bitter cold, but inside the cabin, life was warm and full. Frank marveled at how such a tiny person could demand so much attention and give so much joy in return. He woke for the night feedings, changing diapers and walking the floor when Thomas was fussy, giving Willa a chance to rest. "You are a good father," Willa told him one night, watching him rock their son. "I am trying to be. You are succeeding." As Thomas grew, the ranch prospered. Frank's herd increased, and he gained a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Neighbors came to him for advice, and he became a respected figure in the valley. Willa thrived as well. She joined the Ladies' Auxiliary in Dillon, making friends and becoming part of the community. She still had her quiet strength, the courage that had gotten her across that frozen river, but now it was tempered with contentment. 2 years after Thomas was born, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Emma. She had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, and from the moment she could walk, she followed Frank everywhere. "She is going to be a rancher," Willa said, watching Emma toddle after Frank to the barn. "She can be whatever she wants," Frank replied, "as long as she is happy." More children followed. Another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful. Twin girls, Alice and Charlotte, who were mischief incarnate. With each birth, the cabin grew more crowded, and finally, Frank built a proper house. 2 stories with enough bedrooms for everyone and a big kitchen where Willa could cook, and the children could do their lessons. The years passed in a blur of spring brandings and summer haying, of school recitals and church socials, of hard work and simple pleasures. Frank and Willa grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They visited Sarah and John in Virginia City most summers, the trip becoming a tradition that the children looked forward to. Sarah and John had children of their own, and the cousins formed close bonds. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Willa back to the place where they had crossed the frozen river. It was summer now, and the river ran swift and clear, no hint of ice anywhere. "You remember?" he asked, standing on the bank where he had first seen her. "How could I forget?" Willa replied, "I was terrified. The wagon had broken down, and I had no idea how I was going to get across. Then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even finished praying. I remember thinking you were the most determined person I had ever seen. You were not crying or falling apart." You were just standing there, figuring out what to do next. I was not that calm inside, believe me. Willa slipped her hand into his. But I knew I had to keep moving forward. I could not give up. You were so brave on that barge, Frank said. When we were fighting the ice and the water was coming in and everything was going wrong, you never panicked. Your courage made me forget about the cold, about the danger. All I could think about was getting us to the other side. Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. We made it together. That is what matters. They stood there for a long time, watching the river flow past, remembering that desperate crossing and marveling at how far they had come. I would do it again, Willa said finally. Cross that frozen river, risk everything, all of it, because it brought me to you. And I would help a stranded woman on a riverbank 1,000 times over, Frank replied, if it meant I got to spend my life with you. The children grew. Thomas became a rancher like his father, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Frank's hair turned gray. Emma married a doctor and moved to Helena, where she worked tirelessly to improve conditions in the city's hospital. James became a teacher, patient and kind with his students. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch, causing much merriment at family gatherings. Frank and Willa became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The ranch that Frank had built with his own hands was now a thriving operation, managed by Thomas and his sons. The Ruby Valley had changed too, with more ranches and better roads, though it still retained the wild beauty that Frank had fallen in love with all those years ago. On a warm summer evening in 1923, 40 years after they had met, Frank and Willa sat on the porch of the house they had built together. They were both in their late 60s now, their bodies marked by years of hard work, but their minds were sharp and their love as strong as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked. "Giving up your independence to marry an old cowboy?" Willa laughed. "You were not old when we married, and no, I have never regretted it, not for a single moment. Even when I tracked mud through your clean kitchen, even then." Willa reached over and took his hand, her fingers still fitting perfectly between his. "You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible, Frank. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You gave me a home." "You gave me those things too," Frank said. "Before you, I was just existing. You made me live." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. Around them, they could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant laughter of their grandchildren playing in the yard. "Tell me the story again," Willa said. "About the frozen river." Frank smiled. It was a story they had told countless times to their children and grandchildren, to anyone who asked how they had met, but it never got old. "It was February 14th, 1883, he began. "The coldest day I could remember. I was riding along the Beaverhead River when I saw a woman standing by a broken-down wagon." As he talked, Willa closed her eyes, remembering. She could still feel the bite of that wind, could still see the chunks of ice floating in the black water. She could still remember the terror and the exhilaration of pushing that barge across the current, of fighting for her life alongside a man she had just met. But what she remembered most was the moment when she had looked at Frank, really looked at him, and seen not just a helpful stranger but a partner. A man who would stand beside her through whatever life threw their way. A man worth risking everything for. "We made it across," Frank concluded, squeezing her hand. "Soaked and freezing, but we made it, and I knew right then, though I did not want to admit it, that I was falling in love with you." "I knew it too," Willa said softly. "Your courage matched mine, and together we were unstoppable." As the stars came out, one by one, Frank and Willa remained on their porch, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. The frozen river was long behind them, but its lessons remained. courage in the face of fear, partnership in the face of adversity, love strong enough to weather any storm. That night, lying in bed together as they had for 40 years, Willa curled into Frank's side, her head on his chest. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Frank replied, his arms around her. "Always have, always will." They fell asleep like that, two souls intertwined, their story complete. It had begun with a desperate woman and a willing cowboy, a frozen river and a rickety barge. It had grown through hard work and devotion, through children and grandchildren, through joys and sorrows shared equally. And it ended, decades later, with two people who still held hands every evening and still told the story of how they met, who still marveled at the courage they had found in each other, and who knew, without question, that crossing that frozen river had been the best decision either of them had ever made. The ranch continued for generations, a testament to what Frank and Willa had built. Their descendants scattered across Montana and beyond, but they all knew the story. The story of the cowboy who had helped a widow across a frozen river, and how her courage in that ice and cold had made him forget everything except the certainty that he had found something precious. Something worth any risk, any hardship, any challenge. They had found love. And in the wild, harsh, beautiful landscape of Montana in the 1800s, where survival itself was a daily battle, that love had been their greatest victory. It had sustained them through everything life threw at them, and it had left a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. On Frank's gravestone, placed next to Willa's when he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, their children had inscribed a simple epitaph. Together they crossed the frozen river, and together they built a life. May they rest now, side by side as they always lived. But they were not truly at rest. Their spirit lived on in every member of the family who showed courage in difficult times, who partnered with their spouse as equals, who understood that love was not just a feeling, but a choice made every single day. The barge that had carried them across the Beaverhead River had long since rotted away, but what it represented endured. It represented the moment when two strangers had trusted each other enough to face danger together. The moment when fear had been overcome by determination and hope. And on cold February nights, when the wind howled down from the mountains and ice formed on the river, the family would gather around the fire and tell the story again. The story of Frank and Willa, of courage and love and a crossing that had changed everything. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. Because it reminded them all that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness, and that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward despite it. Frank and Willa's love story was not perfect or always easy, but it was real and it was enduring, and in the end, that was what mattered most. They had found each other when they needed each other most, and they had built a life together that was fuller and richer than either could have imagined. The frozen river had tested them, but it had not defeated them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, something unbreakable. And that strength had carried them through 40 years of marriage, through all the joys and sorrows that life brings. As the last light faded from the Montana sky on the night Frank was laid to rest beside his beloved wife, their children and grandchildren stood together in the cemetery, united in their grief, but also in their gratitude. Gratitude for the example Frank and Willa had set, for the love they had shared, and for the legacy they had left behind. The Ruby Valley stretched out around them, beautiful and eternal, a fitting resting place for two people who had loved it so well. And as the family walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, toward the home that Frank had built and Willa had made warm, they carried with them the story. The story of a cowboy and a widow, a frozen river and a desperate crossing. The story of courage and love, and two people who had been brave enough to reach for happiness when it appeared before them. It was a story that would never end, not really, because it lived on in every heart that heard it, in every person who chose to be courageous, who chose to love deeply, who chose to face life's challenges with a partner by their side. Frank and Willa Emerson had crossed that frozen river together, and in doing so, they had found not just the opposite bank but each other. They had found a love that warmed them through the coldest winters, that sustained them through the hardest times, that gave meaning and purpose to every day they shared. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave. Not wealth or fame or achievement, but love. Simple, pure, enduring love. The kind of love that makes heroes out of ordinary people and transforms a desperate river crossing into the beginning of a beautiful life. The stars came out over Montana, the same stars that had shone down on Frank and Willa's wedding night, on the births of their children, on all the important moments of their lives together. And in their light, the story continued, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that courage and love can overcome any obstacle, can bridge any divide, can turn a frozen river into a pathway to happiness. Frank and Willa's story was complete. Their journey ended, but the love they had shared lived on, warming the hearts of all who knew them and inspiring everyone who heard their tale. It was a testament to the power of human connection, to the strength found in partnership, and to the transformative nature of love. And somewhere, in the eternal embrace of the Montana earth, Frank and Willa rested together at last, their hands still clasped, their hearts still joined, their love story forever etched into the landscape they had called home.